What happens when a country that has built its entire identity on control suddenly asks its own people to switch off the lights? Not as a metaphor, not as propaganda, but as a literal instruction broadcast to millions. On April 25th, 2026, Iran's president appeared on national television and delivered a message that sounded less like leadership and more like surrender to reality. Citizens were told to reduce household lighting dramatically. Instead of running 10 lamps, they were instructed to use 2. Government offices shifted to half-day operations. The Tehran metro reported repeated heating interruptions. Even major cities like Isfahan and Tabriz saw street lighting cut in half. This was not the language of a state in control. It was the language of a system quietly acknowledging its own limits. And yet, for decades, Iran had projected the opposite image. A nation sitting on some of the world's largest oil reserves. A country that repeatedly warned it could shut down the Strait of Hormuz and send shockwaves through the global economy. A government that built an entire strategic identity around one core belief: that no external pressure could force it into collapse. But in 2026, that belief was being tested in real time. Welcome to Dr. Elena Harris. If you are new here, this is where we break down the military, geopolitical, and economic shifts that are reshaping global power. And what is unfolding right now around Iran is not a conventional crisis. It is a systematic breakdown of a long-standing strategic model, not through invasion alone, but through coordinated economic and infrastructural pressure that is tightening from multiple directions at once. Because while Iran once threatened closure of Hormuz as leverage over the world had already been preparing for that moment. Before we go further, understand the scale of what Hormuz represents. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only 34 kilometers wide. Through that narrow corridor once passed nearly 20 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 1/5 of global seaborne oil trade. China, India, Japan, South Korea, and much of Europe all depended on it in varying degrees. For Iran, this was not just geography. It was leverage, a choke point that turned physical location into political power. For decades, Iranian strategy relied on a simple assumption: if this passage is ever threatened, the world will have no choice but to negotiate. And for years, that assumption remained untested, until 2026. On February 28th, coordinated strikes by the United States and Israel targeted Iranian infrastructure. In response, Iran executed what it had long warned it would do. It moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping traffic collapsed almost immediately. Within days, maritime flow dropped by more than 70%. Iranian forces began boarding vessels, laying naval mines, and issuing direct warnings to commercial shipping lanes. Oil prices surged sharply, breaching $120 per barrel, as global markets reacted to the sudden disruption. For a brief moment, it looked like Iran's long-standing strategy might be working. But what Iran had never fully accounted for was what the world had been building in parallel. Because while the threat of Hormuz closure had remained static for years, global energy systems had not. Alternate pipelines, strategic reserves, shipping reroutes, satellite tracking systems, and naval coordination frameworks had all been quietly developed. Not as a single response, but as a distributed system designed to reduce dependence on a single corridor. And when Iran finally acted on its threat, that system activated. Not dramatically at first, but precisely. What followed was not just a military reaction. It was an economic counterstructure. From this point forward, the crisis stopped being about a single choke point. It became about whether Iran could survive the consequences of a world that no longer needed to move through it in the same way. And that is where the real pressure began to build. Because once the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, the response did not stay limited to the water. It expanded into a coordinated economic containment strategy that targeted Iran's ability not just to export oil, but to function as an oil-dependent state at all. On April 13th, 2026, the United States implemented what analysts began describing as a naval blockade around key Iranian maritime routes. This did not just reinforce pressure in the Strait of Hormuz. It extended into broader enforcement across Iranian export pathways, creating a dual-layer system of restriction. Iran was attempting to restrict global energy flow outward, while its own exports were being restricted inwardly. The immediate effect was measurable and severe. Before the blockade tightened, Iranian crude and condensate exports were averaging roughly 2.1 million barrels per day. Within days of the enforcement shift, that figure collapsed to around 567,000 barrels per day. In less than 2 weeks, export activity dropped to a fraction of its previous level. What this meant in practical terms was simple. Oil was no longer leaving the country at a sustainable rate. And when a system built on constant export flow is suddenly blocked, the consequences do not pause. They accumulate. Crude oil that could not be shipped did not disappear. It was redirected into storage infrastructure across the country. Tank farms began filling at a pace that alarmed energy analysts, monitoring satellite data. One of the most critical hubs, the Karg Island terminal, which handles the majority of Iran's crude exports, rapidly approached capacity thresholds. By April 20th, storage utilization at Karg Island had reached roughly 3/4 full. That number matters because oil infrastructure is not designed to operate at maximum capacity for extended periods. Above a certain threshold, operational risk increases sharply. Pressure builds. Safety margins shrink. Logistics become more fragile. Analysts began estimating that Iran had only a limited window before storage saturation forced production cuts. Some projections placed that window at just a few weeks, if export restrictions remained unchanged. And that is where the situation shifted from export disruption to structural economic stress. Because once storage fills, production cannot continue at normal levels. Wells must be throttled or shut down. And shutting down oil wells is not like turning off a tap. Especially in older fields like many of Iran's, restarting production can be difficult, expensive, and in some cases permanently damaging. This is where energy analysts introduced a more serious term: irreversible production loss. It refers to the point where shutting in oil wells does not just pause output, but permanently reduces future capacity. In other words, the longer the blockade persisted, the more Iran risked losing not just current revenue, but future production potential as well. This is why estimates quickly escalated into a wider concern. Some analysts suggested Iran could lose between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day of long-term production capacity if shutdown conditions continued. At the same time, pressure was not only physical, it was financial. With exports collapsing, daily revenue losses were estimated to climb into hundreds of millions of dollars per day. Economic analysts tracking the situation warned that the system was entering a compounding phase, where each additional day of blockade did not just maintain pressure, but deepened structural damage. Inside Iran, this external shock collided with existing internal fragility. Even before the escalation, inflation had been running at extremely high levels. Currency devaluation had already weakened purchasing power. Essential goods, including food and medicine, were becoming increasingly expensive and harder to access. So when export revenue collapsed, the impact did not stay inside government accounts. It spread quickly into daily life. And while all of this was unfolding, another layer of enforcement was tightening in parallel. Naval operations were not only restricting export movement, but also actively tracking and intercepting vessels suspected of attempting to bypass restrictions. Ships that once relied on simple evasion tactics, like disabling tracking systems or changing identifiers, now faced persistent satellite monitoring and coordinated maritime surveillance. Several vessels were redirected or detained, signaling that the maritime space was no longer operating under ambiguity. What made this phase particularly significant was not just the enforcement itself, but the speed at which it reduced operational flexibility. Iran was no longer dealing with a slow, predictable sanctions environment. It was dealing with a dynamic system that adjusted in near real time. And as this system tightened, a second strategic consequence began to emerge. Iran's assumption had always been that pressure could be absorbed because global dependence on its oil transit routes would prevent sustained enforcement. But as alternate routes, pipelines, and shipping adjustments came online, that assumption weakened. Each new adjustment reduced Iran's leverage slightly more. And with each reduction, the economic pressure inside the country increased further, setting the stage for a crisis that was no longer just about energy exports, but about state capacity itself. And as that leverage continued to erode, the crisis stopped being a matter of external pressure alone and started becoming a question of internal endurance. Because once export income drops below a certain threshold, a state does not simply earn less. It begins to reorganize around scarcity, and in Iran's case, that reorganization was already becoming visible in real time. By late April 2026, storage capacity constraints were no longer theoretical projections. They were operational limits approaching fast. Analysts monitoring satellite imagery of key facilities reported tanks filling at levels that left very little buffer for continued production. At the same time, export shipments were so restricted that only a handful of cargoes were leaving Iranian terminals over multi-day periods. This created a dangerous imbalance. Production was still occurring, but the system designed to move that production into global markets was effectively blocked. And when that happens, oil stops being an export asset and becomes a storage burden. Inside the energy sector, this is where decisions become irreversible. Because shutting wells is not a neutral action. It is a mechanical intervention in a system that depends on constant pressure and flow stability. If production is reduced too quickly or maintained without export relief, reservoirs can degrade. Equipment can suffer damage. Recovery becomes uncertain. That is why analysts began warning that Iran was approaching a forced production adjustment phase, where output would have to be reduced not because demand had fallen, but because the system had no physical space left to store what was being produced. At the same time, financial pressure was accelerating. With export revenues collapsing, the government's ability to maintain subsidies, pay public sector wages, and stabilize currency flows came under strain. Iran's economy, already weakened by inflation and currency depreciation in previous years, was now absorbing a shock that affected both liquidity and confidence at the same time. Markets reacted accordingly. Currency instability increased. Domestic prices for essential goods rose further. Imported products, particularly pharmaceuticals and industrial components, became harder to obtain or significantly more expensive. What makes this phase critical is not just economic contraction, but speed. Economic systems can often absorb gradual decline. They struggle far more when multiple pressure points activate simultaneously. In Iran's case, export collapse, storage saturation, currency pressure, and infrastructure constraints were all converging within the same short window. And as economic pressure intensified, enforcement pressure on maritime routes also evolved. The naval containment system did not remain static. It adapted. Surveillance expanded across broader areas, including secondary shipping lanes and alternative export routes that Iran had historically relied on as backup pathways. Satellite tracking, maritime intelligence, and coordinated naval presence created a monitoring environment where vessel movement could be identified, followed, and intercepted with high accuracy. This changed behavior at sea. Ships that once attempted to evade detection by disabling tracking systems or altering identification signals found that these tactics were no longer sufficient. Movement patterns could still be reconstructed through satellite imaging and cross-referenced tracking data. As a result, shipping activity did not just slow. It became risk-sensitive. Each voyage carried higher uncertainty, and that uncertainty itself began to suppress trade volume even before direct intervention occurred. At this stage, Iran's response strategy began to encounter a structural problem. The leverage it had historically relied on, the ability to threaten disruption of global energy flows, was no longer producing proportional strategic pressure. Instead, the disruption was feeding back into Iran's own system faster than it was affecting global markets. This is a critical shift. In strategic terms, it means the asymmetry of pressure is breaking down. A tool that once created external dependence is now generating internal constraint. And that shift became even more visible as alternative supply routes began scaling up. Pipelines and bypass infrastructure in neighboring regions, along with increased output flexibility from other producers, started absorbing part of the shock created by Hormuz disruption. While global energy markets did experience volatility and price spikes, they did not enter a sustained collapse scenario. Instead, they adjusted. That adjustment mattered, because Iran's long-standing strategy depended on a specific assumption that global energy systems could not adapt quickly enough to bypass Hormuz pressure. In 2026, that assumption no longer held, and as global systems adapted faster than expected, Iran's internal system had to absorb more of the shock alone. That is when domestic pressure began to move closer to the surface. Economic stress does not remain abstract for long in a tightly constrained system. It translates into employment disruption, wage pressure, reduced industrial output, and ultimately, public dissatisfaction. By late April, reports from within the country already indicated increasing strain across industrial sectors, particularly in oil-linked industries, steel production, and petrochemicals. These sectors are not isolated parts of the economy, they are interconnected nodes. When one slows, others follow. And as these sectors slowed, unemployment pressure began to rise, adding another layer of instability on top of existing inflation and currency stress. At this point, the crisis was no longer just about export blockade or maritime control. It had become a multi-layered economic contraction, affecting production, revenue, employment, and public stability simultaneously. And the longer it continued, the more difficult it became to isolate a single point of recovery. And once multiple pressure points begin collapsing at the same time, the system stops behaving like a crisis that can be managed and starts behaving like a structure that is slowly losing coherence. By the final days of April 2026, Iran's internal economic strain was no longer hidden in technical reports or market data. It was visible in operational decisions across the country. Industrial activity was slowing in sectors tied directly to energy exports. Steel production, petrochemical output, and associated logistics chains were all experiencing disruption linked to both export restrictions and energy reallocation. What made this phase particularly significant was not just the slowdown itself, but the way it spread. In tightly interconnected economies, industrial contraction does not stay isolated. When energy-intensive sectors reduce output, supply chains upstream and downstream are immediately affected. Transportation demand falls. Raw material orders decrease. Employment contracts are suspended or not renewed. Each of these effects reinforces the next. At the same time, financial pressure inside the state system was intensifying. With oil exports sharply reduced, government revenue streams contracted at the exact moment expenditure demands remained fixed. Public sector wages, subsidies, and operational costs do not adjust easily in real time. That mismatch creates fiscal strain that typically forces either borrowing, currency adjustment, or spending cuts. But in Iran's case, all three options were constrained simultaneously. Currency instability increased as foreign exchange inflows weakened. Inflation, already high before the escalation, began to accelerate further as imported goods became more expensive and supply chains tightened. Essential items, including food and medicine, became increasingly difficult for average households to afford at stable prices. This is where macroeconomic pressure becomes social pressure. Because inflation is not experienced as a statistic, it is experienced as a reduction in daily stability. It appears in shorter purchasing lists at markets, longer queues for basic goods, and rising uncertainty about the cost of essentials. At the same time, energy restrictions inside the country added another layer of disruption. The decision to reduce electricity consumption, limit public lighting, and scale back government operations reflected a broader constraint on energy distribution within the domestic system itself. These were not symbolic measures. They were functional responses to a system balancing internal demand against reduced export-driven capacity. Meanwhile, outside pressure continued to tighten. Naval enforcement operations remained active, and maritime movement patterns continued to reflect a constrained environment. Ships attempting to navigate alternative routes faced increased monitoring and interception risk. The result was not total cessation of trade, but a persistent reduction in predictable flow. And in global energy logistics, unpredictability itself acts as a suppressing force, because shipping is not just about physical movement. It is about scheduling, contracts, insurance, and financial hedging. When uncertainty increases, costs rise. When costs rise, volume decreases. And when volume decreases, revenue contracts further. This feedback loop was now operating across multiple layers simultaneously. Inside Iran, political institutions were also adjusting to the growing strain. Emergency meetings within security and economic councils began to focus not only on external threats, but on internal stability timelines. Assessments reportedly shifted toward shorter survival windows under sustained pressure conditions. What is important here is not just the existence of internal analysis, but its direction. When a state's internal security assessments begin focusing on endurance timelines rather than policy outcomes, it signals a shift from strategic planning to contingency management. At the same time, external geopolitical responses were reshaping Iran's strategic environment. Regional actors began adjusting their own energy and trade alignments. Investment decisions were redirected toward alternative infrastructure. Long-term projects that once positioned Iran as a central transit hub were reconsidered or paused. Some partnerships were quietly restructured to avoid exposure to ongoing instability. This is where geopolitical isolation becomes economically measurable. It does not happen through declarations alone. It happens through the gradual rerouting of capital, infrastructure, and logistical trust. One of the most significant developments during this phase was the acceleration of alternative export routes by other Gulf producers. Pipeline capacity expansions and maritime diversification strategies began absorbing market demand that previously relied on more constrained routes. This reduced Iran's strategic leverage further, because global buyers now had more flexibility in sourcing supply without depending on contested corridors. As a result, Iran's ability to use energy flow disruption as a bargaining mechanism weakened in real time. And as that leverage diminished, internal pressure continued to accumulate. By late April, estimates from energy analysts suggested that storage capacity constraints could force production adjustments within a matter of weeks if export conditions did not improve. This created a narrowing operational window in which decisions about output, storage management, and export prioritization had to be made under increasing uncertainty. At the same time, labor and employment pressures were building. Industrial slowdowns translated into job losses or reduced working hours in sectors tied to energy production and processing. As wages became less stable and inflation continued rising, household financial stress increased further. Each layer of this system, industrial output, fiscal stability, currency value, employment, and energy distribution, was now influencing the others simultaneously. And when that happens, the system stops behaving like a sequence of problems and starts behaving like a single interconnected constraint. At this stage, Iran was no longer dealing with isolated challenges. It was operating under synchronized pressure across its economic, logistical, and strategic foundations, with each component reinforcing the instability of the others. By this point, the crisis was no longer unfolding in separate categories like energy, finance, or security. It had merged into a single continuous pressure system where every failure point reinforced the next, leaving very little room for stabilization. Inside Iran, the most immediate sign of this convergence was the strain on daily economic functioning. Industrial output had already slowed across multiple sectors, but now the slowdown was feeding directly into employment instability at a broader scale. Workers in energy-linked industries, logistics, and heavy manufacturing began facing reduced hours, suspended operations, or delayed wages. This is where economic contraction becomes socially visible. It stops being about national indicators and starts becoming about household survival. When wages become unpredictable and prices continue rising, the gap between income and cost of living widens quickly. That gap is what drives systemic instability. At the same time, the currency continued to weaken under sustained pressure. With export revenue sharply reduced, foreign exchange inflows became limited, forcing the domestic currency into a more fragile position. Inflation, already elevated before the escalation, began accelerating further as imported goods became more expensive and supply chains tightened. Medicine prices rose significantly. Essential food items became less accessible at stable prices. Industrial imports, particularly those tied to maintenance and production equipment, became harder to source consistently. These are not isolated shortages. They are structural symptoms of a system under external constraint and internal imbalance at the same time. Meanwhile, energy distribution inside the country was also being adjusted under pressure. Electricity rationing measures, reduced operational hours in government institutions, and controlled consumption policies reflected the reality that domestic energy allocation had to be prioritized more strictly as export capacity declined. These adjustments were not symbolic. They were operational decisions made to preserve system stability under reduced external revenue. But they also had secondary effects. Reduced public services and shorter operating hours across institutions slowed administrative efficiency, which in turn affected economic coordination. Outside the country, maritime enforcement continued shaping the environment. Shipping routes remained under persistent surveillance, and vessel movement in and around key waterways became increasingly constrained. Ships attempting to navigate alternative paths faced higher operational risk, increased insurance costs, and greater likelihood of interception or redirection. This created a secondary economic effect that extended beyond Iran itself. Global energy logistics adjusted to uncertainty by rerouting supply chains, increasing storage buffers, and diversifying sourcing strategies. In practical terms, this meant Iran's leverage over global oil transit was continuing to weaken even as the immediate crisis persisted. Because leverage in energy geopolitics depends not just on control of geography, but on exclusivity of access. Once alternative routes and supply mechanisms begin scaling, the strategic value of a choke point declines. That is exactly what was happening in parallel. At the same time, internal political assessments within Iran began reflecting a more compressed timeline for stability. Reports from security and economic councils indicated growing concern about the sustainability of current conditions under prolonged blockade pressure. The language used in internal discussions reportedly shifted toward limited endurance windows rather than long-term adjustment strategies. This is a key indicator of systemic stress. When internal planning moves from strategy to time-constrained survival estimation, it reflects a narrowing of policy space, and that narrowing was being driven by a combination of factors operating simultaneously. Declining export revenue, rising domestic inflation, constrained storage capacity, reduced industrial output, and increasing employment pressure. Each factor alone would be manageable. Together, they form a compounding system. By late April 2026, estimates from energy analysts suggested that Iran's storage infrastructure was approaching operational limits at critical export terminals. This meant production could no longer continue at previous levels without either expanding storage capacity, restoring export flow, or reducing output. None of those options were easily available under current conditions. At the same time, international energy markets had already begun adjusting to the disruption. While prices initially surged in response to the Strait of Hormuz closure, they did not continue escalating indefinitely. Instead, markets stabilized at a higher but manageable range as alternative supply routes and increased output from other producers compensated for part of the disruption. This stabilization is crucial because it reduced the long-term leverage of the crisis. What initially appeared as a potential sustained global shock began evolving into a regional containment scenario instead. That shift changed the strategic balance, because Iran's original assumption was that disruption in Hormuz would create sustained global pressure that would force negotiation. But as the system adapted, the pressure became asymmetrical. Iran absorbed more of the sustained damage, while global markets partially adjusted around it. Inside Iran, the social impact of this imbalance was becoming more visible. Economic strain translated into increasing public dissatisfaction, especially as employment uncertainty and price instability continued to grow. Labor tensions, already present before the escalation, became more sensitive under conditions of reduced economic security. At this stage, the system was no longer defined by a single crisis event. It was defined by the interaction between external containment and internal fragility. And as that interaction intensified, the remaining question was no longer whether pressure existed, but how long the internal system could continue operating under it before structural limits were reached.